Okay, so so the big question, of course, from the perspective of 2015 is what happened? Why didn't these uprisings work in a sense? Or maybe more, the more open-minded question would be, what do these uprisings mean from the perspective of a couple of years on? One question is, how much did they really change? If we look around the region now, certainly there are regimes that fell and new regimes that came in, but you also have a lot of chaos in certain areas and some where you simply don't have much of a government at all. So do these, this series of uprisings mean that the kind of authoritarian regime that used to prevail can no longer do so? Or does it simply mean that governments have to find some way to either co-opt or to control the people more? Does it mean that there's more incentive for regimes to crack down and less incentive for regimes to open up and allow more political freedoms? Does it mean that for young people, for example, that they will continue to be inspired to take action? As John Esposito said, the genie is out of the bottle now. You can no longer pretend that acting against the regime isn't possible. Everyone can look at this and sort of say, when things get too bad, we can take to the streets. Or in fact, does it show young people that political activity is futile? That no matter what you do, no matter how many thousands of people, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people you mobilize, in the end, that political activity will not get you a real place at the table. It will not change things for the better. It will not recreate your society in a more open mold. What's the lesson? Does it mean that the ongoing violence, the violence that we continue to see in places like Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen over the last few weeks, in Libya, does that mean that the populations have taken the lesson from that they should not, in fact, agitate for change from their government, because if they do, they're liable to invite a much worse situation than they have under an authoritarian regime? Or does that mean that governments should open up earlier so that they don't invite the kind of chaos that happens when the government tries to retain control, like in Syria? And I don't think that the same message, of course, is taken by everyone in the region. People are taking very different lessons. Although I will say that when you look at polling from people in Iraq, for example, I think the last numbers that I saw, the vast majority of people said that life was better under Saddam Hussein than it is now, that it wasn't worth it to get rid of that dictator. As bad as he was, and nobody would argue that it wasn't a terrible regime, the devastation that has been wrought to the society since then has been, absolutely catastrophic for, communities across the country, whether you're Sunni or Shia or Christian or Yazidi. The situation for these communities has just been absolutely catastrophic. So the Arab uprisings, despite the optimism with which they were greeted by many people in the region and here, certainly have not fulfilled that optimistic promise. And then, of course, the question is it over? Of course, it's not that the violence isn't over in the places that I just mentioned, but is that sense of kind of popular resistance to authoritarianism over? And how do we know? For some reason, we want to be able to end this chapter or to know when a chapter ends. And I just think that history is much messier than that. In general, if I had one answer for the question of why didn't they work, these uprisings, I think that it's because very often these upheavals became much more of a struggle for power than a struggle to govern or to solve problems. And unfortunately, this struggle in the political arena became about controlling the political arena. And there were very few places where people really sat down and thought about how do we deal with these almost intractable problems of unemployment, high youth population, stagnant economies, et cetera, et cetera. And that became a real problem. So that despite the fact that you had regime change, what you didn't have was change in governance, transparency, really trying to get rid of corruption, trying to open up opportunities for young people. That just didn't happen, right? Saeed, that's a good question. Let's come back to that in a few minutes, because we're going to talk about the relationship between these states and religion. Now, of course, we do have one bright spot, I suppose, at least at the moment, knock on wood. We can look at Tunisia as being somewhat of an outlier here. Tunisia just had its second round of elections since the revolution. In the first round, it had the first free and fair elections after the Arab uprisings began. And in that first set of elections, an Islamist party, Ennahda, came to power. But afterward, there were further protests, popular protests, against some of the moves that Ennahda was making, particularly in regard to gender and other kind of social Islamization. And so there were new elections called, and the government that was just elected is a unity government, but dominated by a more secular party with Ennahda as the junior partner participating in the government. And that experiment in democracy so far has not been without challenges, of course. There's still corruption. There's still human rights issues. There is certainly still the problem of stagnant economy. Nonetheless, for example, Freedom House just designated Tunisia as the first free Arab country since 1975, when Lebanon had that rating. So it's very interesting to see that you could, in fact, have, at least one place where this came together in a way that was a bit of a brighter story. And Charles, that's a really good question, and I think that's one of the most fundamental issues with the Arab Spring, is that when these authoritarian regimes are toppled and elections come about, the problem is that democracy really requires people to have enormous faith in the continuance of that system. And it's hard to do. When you've just toppled one system, how do you decide that the next system that you've just put up, this brand new infant democratic system, is going to stick around forever? So that if you lose the next election, then the party that wins will allow the next election, and you'll have a chance then. Or maybe you'll have a chance in the election after that. There's very little, because there's so little faith in the government to have the people's best interest at heart when you started these uprisings. The idea that people would immediately then acquiesce in the rise to power of some party that they don't support and believe that they would have their next chance at the ballot box, that's a pretty big leap of faith, right? And the other piece of that is that you have to also believe, or you have to enshrine in law and in social practice, that the minorities, whether you're talking about ethnic minorities or religious minorities or political minorities, will be fairly treated under a majoritarian regime. Now, nothing in people's past history of government had given them any reason to believe that these things would be true. The other piece of it is that we tend to think that democracy is about elections. And in fact, democracy is much more about the institutions that support the change of government, right? So you have to have an independent judiciary. You have to have transparency in government bureaucracy, in taxation and the spending of money on social services. You have to have a way to challenge corruption. You know, all of those things, the rule of law and a system of law and a system of judicial enactment of law that people trust to be fair. And there was nothing, again, in these societies that could make people believe that that would be the case. So without a transition to a set of institutions that people trusted, democracy in and of itself was not going to convince people to be in this democratic experiment for the long haul. And this is, of course, what happened in Egypt, right? So this is the an infographic that The Economist put together last summer, looking at the results of the Arab Spring, right? Where were things now? And it was a very kind of pessimistic article, and basically arguing that the failures of the Arab Spring came about because, of the history of the region, that these were built into the past and to a certain extent into the culture. So it's a pretty depressing story when you look at this, and I don't necessarily buy exactly the way that they divide up in this subjective judgment about what's a democracy, what's a semi-democracy, what's a democratic facade, what's an absolute monarchy, etc. The labels, again, are interesting and one can quibble, but the fact is that there are not a lot of places that are actually better off now than they were before their uprisings in a sense of at least personal security of people or the economic outlook. So I think it's really interesting to look at this from the perspective of just whether elections are successful. In Egypt, clearly what happened when the first set of elections resulted in a win for the Muslim Brotherhood and Morsi, many people felt that he was giving, first of all, he was imposing far too much of his own party's ideas on the population, and secondly, that he was making noises that implied that they would not, in fact, give up power in another election, and that therefore they were not adhering to what people were assuming was the new social contract. So if you don't have faith that the electoral system is going to work and be fair, then why not go back to the same thing that got the last regime out, right? Get everybody onto the street. And then you had a lot of pressure against the Morsi regime, a lot of big, huge popular protests against the Morsi regime, and then you had what most people would call a coup by the military, the installation eventually of al-Sisi, and then you had mass protests against the al-Sisi government, against the coup in favor of the Morsi government, and you had very brutal repression of those protests as well. So when you look at that case, it's very difficult for either Egyptians or people looking at Egypt to feel like risking everything on a democratic transition is going to be a really good idea, especially if you don't belong to the majoritarian ideology. If there are a lot of people who believe something very different from you, what are the chances that you are ever going to have a chance to be the governing majority? Because if the first person past the post takes all the power and refuses to give it up again, then you could be in for another 30 years of some Mubarak-like figure, right? So that's one lesson, I think, from the Arab Spring that people have learned. And the other is, as I said before, that stability might be better than revolution, given the consequences of revolution in places like Yemen or Syria or Libya. So the outcomes of the Arab Spring so far is that in general, authoritarianism is still entrenched. Young people are still not incorporated, and you still have stagnant economies, you still have unemployment. We have the rise of radical Islam across the region, particularly, of course, with Daesh, Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, but also a lot of smaller groups that are aligning themselves with them. And it's interesting, actually, looking at the rise of these Islamic groups. If I could take 1 second to talk about that for a moment. On the one hand, these radical groups found an opportunity because as regimes fell or were challenged by popular protests, the police institutions were often either disbanded to a certain extent, delegitimized, defunded, reorganized. So the ability of these states to keep a lid on, extremist challenges from Salafi jihadists, that was very much compromised. So the fact that the police were implicated in the authoritarian states meant that after or in the process of these uprisings, there was more space for radical Islamist groups to operate because the police state was no longer an efficient police state. The other piece of it is that the governments, because new governments did not address the real underlying grievances of people, you had people who said, look, I tried doing this popular protest thing. I tried supporting democracy, and still nothing has changed in my situation. So that these radical groups had, a pool of disaffected, frustrated young men, some of whom they could sway to their cause. And they were very good at swaying them to their cause, right? So they had very dynamic and innovative ways of bringing them on board. So that really helped spread this rise of radical Islam. And then it sort of brought on these huge new challenges in the region as well, with the refugee crisis from the war in Syria is just incredible, difficult to understand. Something like a quarter of the population of Lebanon now are Syrian refugees. How does a small state cope with that? How does a state like Jordan cope with millions of refugees from Syria coming in? Of course, these wars, the continuing civil war challenged by ISIS in Iraq, which even before that was very unstable, and economic crisis in states across the region. Additionally, we have the exacerbation of Sunni-Shia tensions in lots of very complicated and interesting ways. So this is not, in general, a basket full of happiness in the region. If we look at religion and politics, a lot of this I think I've talked about a little bit, but in the same way that the regimes before these uprisings tried to either control Islamist movements or repress them or to co-opt them into supporting the regime, the current regimes are trying to do the same thing one way or another. Despite those attempts, though, really I think you would have to say that these Islamic opposition groups have been the ones who gained the most in this. In some ways, they gained legitimacy because they came to power. In other ways, in Egypt, for example, they've gained legitimacy because they are not allowed to take power or they were kicked out of power. In Yemen, the Houthis have gained legitimacy because they've been able to take over Sana'a and put themselves into power and into the kind of renegotiation of the power structure in Yemen. But it's not a static situation, and the arguments over the place of religion in politics and the kind of religion in politics are very much ongoing. I think it's worth pointing out that if you look at Iraq, for example, you find that while the vast majority of people say that they are very, very pious and very committed Muslims, the vast majority of them oppose Daesh and oppose the kind of extremist actions that people take in the name of Islam. So one Islamist is not the same as another Islamist. You can be a Salafi, for example, without being jihadist. And very often we don't really understand these subtle differences between people who we call Islamist. And in Saudi Arabia, you can really see that, for example. So this is a regime whose legitimacy is based on Wahhabi Islam, and yet at the same time, the previous ruler, perhaps the current ruler, we don't know enough about him yet, has a much more pragmatic approach to religion and a much more progressive vision for the country than one might think. And they have been very much at the forefront of trying to tamp down extremist Islamism within their own country and, for example, in Iraq and Syria. And in fact, they support the more secular Sisi against the Muslim Brotherhood, despite the fact that that's a Sunni Islamist group. You would think that Saudi Arabia would be on their side. So you can't see things in terms of religiosity. You can't see things in terms of Sunni Shia because it's much muddier than that. You have cross-cutting alliances across that divide, and very often people who are, Sunnis and Sunnis who don't get along with Shia and Shia who don't get along. And in fact, the Sunni-Shia divide itself is not really based on religion. It's much more based on access to resources. Okay, so most of this I think I've covered. The one thing that I would point out is that there's now a big power struggle between Al-Qaeda and ISIS, or Daesh, which I think you probably covered in the first session on the Islamic State. So even within these religious radical groups, there is a lot of dissent. What's really interesting is despite the fact that religious groups were often the only organized opposition to these authoritarian regimes, radicals have really not been able to take advantage of that fully to secure full control over any country. Even in Iraq, for example, they have relatively thin control over certain areas, and they are not able to govern. So again, once they get into power, they have power, they have rule, but they don't necessarily know how to run things. And that is in general does not lead to long tenancy in the halls of power. Okay, so how do you teach all of this? Again, I just want to say that worry about binary opposites. Islamic and secular, it's more complicated than that. Sunni and Shia, it's more complicated than that. Monarchies versus republics, it just doesn't explain very much. So I think that it's important to complicate all those binaries. I think that it's important not to teach the Arab uprisings or the Arab Spring as being past. It's not over. I'm not sure when history is ever over, despite Fukuyama's end of history. I think that it's more important to teach not just about these events and some kind of arc of events stopping, but looking at that longer arc of the social and demographic and economic and political underpinnings of what happens. So we can go back to that list of possible causes, and I can imagine doing an activity where you had groups in your classroom, each of whom looked at one possible cause and maybe read an article that supported that explanation and then made that case or argued against it for that being a primary cause of the Arab uprising. So it would be really interesting. And I'll just point out this wonderful term that The Economist came up with of heroic nihilism, which is how it argues how Daesh and other extremist movements are able to recruit young people because they have this kind of idealistic sense of throwing themselves at history. I just want to give you a few resources, and we can talk about ones I hope that you guys have used and ideas that you have as well for teaching this. And I'll show you some of these. One is looking at graffiti, one is looking at music, one is looking at data on human development. And I think all of these lead to having students think about what the challenges would be in their lives if they were, for example, in this situation. So this is Gisela Khouries has this terrific map of graffiti in the Arab world. So you can look down here along the bottom and you can see that for each one she gives an example of graffiti, but then she also gives the context of what that graffiti is referring to, which is wonderful because in general we tend to get, here's a bunch of pictures but you can't read the Arabic and you don't recognize the person in the cartoon, so it doesn't really make much sense to you. So this is great because it actually gives you the context. And here you can see, for example, this is a series of art on the martyrs of the revolution in Tunis. And then you have, the next one is a video interview with the artist explaining what he was doing. And you have dozens of these across the regions, really interesting. Here's another site. Betsy actually has a site, although it's not focused on the Arab world. This is one that's on visual art, humor, etc., performance that's all about art related to the Arab world uprisings. And then this is one of my favorite songs, South of Syria, The Voice of Freedom in Egypt. I like this because it also has subtitles, but there are a lot of sites, and I have a listing in the notes that we can give everybody that give you a bunch of different examples of music of the revolution, where you can look at the lyrics and sort of see how these lyrics are expressing the grievances of the population. What were the things they were really fighting against? What made them most angry? And what are their hopes for the future? This is the map of the, I'm sure most of you know, the Arab Human Development Report. That 5 of them were put out, I believe, in the end, and they just have a really good interactive map so that you can map things like population, education, gender issues, and look at how that might have affected the Arab Spring. In general, I just want to say I think this is really a great opportunity for media literacy, having students look at the coverage from the first reporting on the Arab Spring and look at what the biases and what differences in reporting they can find from the hindsight, from the perspective of several years on. Things like having them compare those timelines, but also looking at what they missed in telling that story. So I just think it's really interesting. We get very impatient with history. We want it to be over. We want to know how it turned out. I think we've watched too many movies. I think it would be really interesting to compare the Arab uprisings in terms of how long they've lasted and what the results were with revolutions like the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, take your pick. But it would be really interesting to look at how long do revolutions take and what is it that we expect to happen and how it should end. So I'll leave that there, and we can open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Barbara. I think this is really illuminating as a person, as a fellow historian who likes to think about at least one revolution and spend a lot of time thinking about it. I always enjoy hearing about other revolutions, and as you were talking about these comparative contexts. I know I have a lot of questions, but we do have a limited amount of time, and I want to make sure that we get as many questions answered from participants before we get to my own. So I'm going to remind you there's 2 ways to participate and ask questions. One is in the chat box. That's how we've done it with the last 2 Middle East webinars. The other way to participate is you can click the hand button, which you'll find right under your name in the left-hand side of the screen. That will virtually raise your hand, and then when Barb calls on you, go ahead and press your talk button, and you can use your microphone to ask your question directly. Again, please do keep questions focused this time on Arab Spring and teaching Arab Spring. Again, that term we use in quotes here in this webinar. Barb, I'm not sure if you saw Char's question. Maybe we can start with that. She typed it into the chat box. The gist of it is, you know, are there countries where we maybe shouldn't look at the uprising and the aftermath? It's not really the most important thing to think about in that country in the last few years. I know there's lots of other things going on, but I guess that combines with something that I wanted to ask is, how do we talk about countries like Yemen, for example, where we have both an uprising and more recent events with some groups of Islamists, not to bundle them all together, seizing power?
Right. I mean, it's a great question. I mean, I think that, you know, in general, looking at any of these countries only through the lens of the uprising is itself a mistake. That's our training because of the way that the media works, right? They're dramatic pictures, dramatic events. You know, it obviously pulls our interest, but it also pulls our interest away from the kind of underlying things that may, in the long run, end up being more destructive or more constructive of what happens later than the actual events of the uprising itself. So if we look at, for example, Yemen, a few years ago we were all focused on you know, the rise of the youth-centered protests, the rise of the Nobel laureate Tawakkol Karman. You know, we felt that Yemen was really at a place of national reconciliation and moving forward. You know, Saleh left the country. It looked like things were, you know, from a political perspective, there was a possibility of real rapprochement. But at the same time, the focus on that piece of it missed two things that I think, or three things that are really important kind of underlying pieces. One is that the country really hadn't ever healed from, you know, being brought back and together from the two Yemens that had existed before. You had Sunnis and Shia who felt disaffected with one another, that they didn't have an equivalent representation in governance and access to resources. There really weren't a lot of resources anyway, and those resources are being more and more strained. You have a socioeconomic problem of cost production, which takes a huge amount of water out of other agricultural pursuits and focuses a lot of the economy around this kind of single crop, narcotic crop, as opposed to food production, for example. You know, the underlying economic problems and, environmental problem of the lowering water table. So Yemen, with its very, very young, very fast-growing population, you know, if you just looked at the socioeconomic problems, they would be almost insoluble by a government of technocrats who were really focused on problem solving. And instead of having that, you actually had people wrestling over who got to rule, right? So that I think is one example where focusing on the political machinations may lead you away from understanding what the longer term problems are. Similarly, you could look at Iraq, for example, and look at, you know, there's a sectarian divide, an ethnic divide, but it's largely not about really the political contest amongst those groups as much as it is about a historical sense of injustice, lack of trust amongst the different groups, and access to the biggest prize, which is, of course, oil revenues. So understanding how geography and access to resources and how those resources have been portioned out to different groups, that's really kind of the underlying piece that helps to explain what happens in terms of, you know, kind of popular support or lack of support for any particular government. Syed, let's see your question. Was the leadership of these protest movements inspired by any of the principles of the Western Revolution? Certainly. I mean, you see a lot of people talking about freedom, about democracy. Those ideas are extremely important. Equality, brotherhood, all of those things were referenced by people. But at the same time, they were also referencing very specific local grievances about, you know, subsidies being cut off, or about, you know, people who were connected to the military getting the benefits of international investment, for example. So I think you both have a sense of universality and connection to ideas of human dignity. But you also had very specific grievances and very specific local goals. And I think you have to keep both of those in mind at the same time. So you had, it's interesting to look at some of the chants that people had. So sometimes they were, I'm trying to think of the one that was bread, freedom, and something else. So, you have these very idealistic goal of freedom and bread at the same time. And it was actually very interesting in Gezi Park in Turkey. That uprising happened just after the Hollywood production of Les Miserables came out. And so that the song from Les Miserables, Do You Hear the People Sing, became one of the anthems of the Turkish Gezi Park protests. So there is a sense that there are human connections amongst these different revolutions, or human values that go across civilizations. But I would also say that social justice, that was it. I would also say that the other piece of that is that while there is very strong aspiration to take part in the kind of freedoms that are enjoyed in the West, there's also extremely deep and broad anger at the West, particularly at the United States, for its policy vis-a-vis the Middle East, both support of Israel, but also support of the authoritarian regimes, like Egypt, for example, that oppress the people because we were seen to value stability over democracy, even though we paid lip service to democracy. So there was enormous anger at that hypocrisy in the West, and a sense that we only cared about states that had oil or that had some strategic significance to the United States. So the anger that's addressed at the West was in fact one of the grievances that people often had, and it's one of the reasons that Islamist groups and extremist Islamist movements are able to recruit people, because they can take advantage of the anger that people have at what they see as the unfair way that the United States has exercised its power in the region.
Kind of piggybacking on that idea of drawing inspiration from other revolutions or other movements, or thinking about them in comparative context, whether or not they're related. I thought, as you were talking, it was particularly interesting, the timing of it all. If I remember right, the Occupy movement in the U.S. and in different parts of Western Europe was happening at roughly the same time. Maybe one happened before, maybe one happened after. Not saying linkages, but some of the factors that contributed to the movements and uprisings in the Middle East and North Africa, the age of a lot of the protesters, the use of technology, that sense of anger, local grievances, but also grievances at larger policies affecting the country. It seemed to strike me that that might be an interesting teaching moment in terms of what makes a protest movement, and how can they be the same but also different. I want to ask one final. Oh, go ahead, Barb.
No, I think they were happening pretty much at exactly the same time, and there was some kind of social media dialogue back and forth between these protest movements, but that was not a connection that really took off. And I think partly that's because a lot of people in the region were nervous about being seen to be allied with people in the West, even if they were the underprivileged in the West. There was a sense that they were, by virtue of being, American or French or Spanish or whatever, they were complicit in, certain antagonistic attitudes towards Muslims or the Middle East. And so it was a rather uncomfortable alliance, I think, for a lot of people.
Oh, that makes sense. What was that? I'm sorry?
You had another question?
Oh, yeah. I wanted to ask a final wrap-up question. in the last few minutes, where do you see these movements or the remnants of these movements or policy changes, maybe not necessarily across the entire region, but in local contexts, again, local needs and local feelings and being important here. Where do you see things going in the next few years, let's say the next 5 years in Egypt, even in Tunisia, where things seem to be going well, or at least better than in other places?
That's a great question. I mean, I would love to say that I'm optimistic, but I think that if we really look at the needs of these societies for, problem solving around how do you create more dynamism in the economy so that you can employ more people, how do you reform the educational system so that they're less rote and more analytical so that people are more suited to the needs of the 21st century economy, how do you, those kinds of issues are unfortunately hard to focus on when you have kind of divide and rule politics. And I think that if anything, the lesson that regimes and opposition groups can take from the last few years is that divide and conquer really works. I mean, look at Assad. Everybody was against the Syrian regime. And when the uprising started, and then he blamed the uprising on Sunni radicals. First he blamed it on foreigners, then he blamed it on Sunni radicals. But then he let a bunch of Sunni radical extremists out of prison and, according to many people, attacked the kind of targets that he said they would attack so that he could blame them and justify cracking down on all of the opposition groups because you had these people who were trying to turn Syria into an Islamic state. So, I think that it's very easy for these groups to, for ISIS to blame the Yazidis or Christians or the Shia, and to use hatred of another group to try and get people to go along with them. While you have that kind of politics going on, it makes it very difficult to actually solve the problems that the society truly has. In Tunisia, I'm hopeful that people get that and that there's a bit more of a technocratic focus. In Yemen, I thought that might have been happening until both the outrage against, kind of drone strikes on al-Qaeda targets that had a lot of collateral damage, or the Houthi rebellion. Those things kind of took on so much of a life of their own that, again, it took the focus away from actually trying to problem solve. So I think that it's going to be very hard to move the focus to problem solving over the next few years, given the kind of devastation that's happened in these societies. And that's really where we stand. How do you get in these societies where trust has been so broken and rebroken and broken worse? How do you go back to a place where people are willing to put those differences aside and work together to solve the endemic problems that the societies are facing? It's going to be really hard to have.
Yeah, that
happen.
Seems like an enormous challenge. But
I would like to leave on a really optimistic note. I'm really trying to think of one. Sorry.
No. I think the purpose of this webinar series was not necessarily to shine rainbows into people's homes. We wanted to talk about real issues. We wanted to talk about how do we teach about these real issues that are not only complex and very difficult to navigate, but they're also difficult to talk about in the sense that they're not happy, good feeling stories necessarily, and issues. And I think your presentation.
Well, I was just going to say the one possibility is having, kind of micro solutions rather than statewide solutions, is that people have discovered that they can connect with one another, and there's some hope that smaller groups of people, towns, neighborhoods, individuals and families will kind of try to find ways to leverage those communication techniques to start solving problems locally rather than waiting for the state to do it.
As they say, all politics is local, right? And that is encouraging. Well, I want to thank you again for all the time you spent this evening and leading up to this evening, putting this presentation together and putting your thoughts together. I found it extremely informative, and I'm sure that so many of the participants did today as well. I wanted to skip ahead a couple slides here and remind participants of a few upcoming webinars that we think they might be interested in. We can try the loading. There we go. We have two that I think many people will be interested in. Sorry, let me go back. Got some lag there. The first is the New Negro Movement in Global Perspective, Escape from Harlem. That'll be Thursday, March 26th, 7 to 8:30 p.m. Guest discussant that night will be Dr. Devarian Baldwin of Trinity College. This is a webinar jointly offered by Primary Source and the National Humanities Center. The second is Understanding and Explaining the Ukraine-Russia Conflict, Wednesday, April 8th, 7 p.m. With Dr. Nadia Kravets of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. I think you will find both very informative. You can also stay in touch with Primary Source, Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, and visit our website, of course. I'll be following up, as I have with the other two webinars, with teaching resources and other materials to help you talk about the quote-unquote Arab Springs in your classroom. And again, thank you so much, Barbara, for everything tonight.
Turned off my mic. You are so welcome. It was great to have the chance to talk with you all, and thank you for all your great questions. I wish we had, as always, more time.
Thanks so much, and good night, everyone.
Good night.